3-month period on the exact same x-ray. So something happened in that 3-month window that actually made them better at diagnosing and scanning for patient problems. Other radiologists, though, got worse. They actually dropped by more than 20%. Something, again, happened to them in that 3-month period that actually made them less effective at figuring out what are serious threats to a patient's health. And I was really puzzled by this finding, wanted to know why. I'm trained as an organizational psychologist. My job is to go into organizations and figure out why do people achieve gains in performance or drops in performance, like the radiologists show. And to get to the bottom of this, I started out in a call center setting, leaving the radiologist behind. Ultimately, in the call center setting, the first place I was contacted by an orthopedic company. This is a company that employs a pretty large number of staff. They answer the phones, and they try to book you with an orthopedic surgeon for example, a knee replacement. And they had horrible data. I've never seen statistics so bad in a call center. If you look at their data, here are a couple things they shared with me right off the bat. Number one, approximately 20% of all calls are never answered. So the phone just rings off the hook, and eventually you go to voicemail. The person never calls you back. Secondly, average hold time over 30 minutes. So if you're lucky enough that somebody does answer the phone, you're going to sit there waiting for a long time before you get helped. Third, you often get scheduled with the wrong doctor. So you show up, you've waited 6 weeks, sometimes even 3 months for an appointment. Took you probably a lot of calls to get it. You arrive, and all of a sudden the wrong person is there. You've got to rebook, reschedule, and wait a few more weeks or months to get back in. Not surprisingly, the customers are angry, and they're getting ready to switch. The orthopedic company has been able to stay in business because they have some of the best surgeons in the country. And so people are willing to put up with this, at least for a short period of time, because they want to actually get the best quality care. But it's becoming so unpleasant and so difficult to get that care that they don't do it. So the orthopedic company is worried about losing staff. I go into the call center, and I ask some really simple questions. I start by interviewing 11 call center reps. And I asked them, why are you here? Why did you take this job? Why did you choose call center work? Why did you choose an orthopedic company? And the answers I got really surprised me. I think they're enlightened in some ways by this little survey that's done of a representative sample of Americans every couple years. It's a general social survey, and it says, just think about what you ultimately really want out of a job. It gives you 5 factors. You can rate the importance of your promotions, your income. Do you want to do meaningful work that gives you a sense of accomplishment? Do you want job security, or do you really care most about the hours that you work? So just to get a show of hands, sense of people in the room, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand in just a second for the factor on this list that matters most to you, that you would actually prioritize as your #1 consideration when you're choosing a job. Is it promotions, income, meaningful work, job security, or hours? Let's get a show of hands. How many people put promotions at the top, opportunities for advancements? None of you. Excellent. Rarely anyone responds in positive manner to that. Okay, what about income? How many people care most about your pay? Okay, a few of you. Meaningful work? Okay, a lot of you. Excellent. Job security. And hours. Okay, a few of you really care about when you work as opposed to what you do. So the results we see in this room are not at all surprising. In fact, they're totally consistent with some of the data from the General Social Survey. So I've just pulled 2 years that I think are pretty interesting. One is 1973. You look at the 1973 data, one of the things you see is that meaningful work came up on top then. Over 80% of all Americans in this study actually ranked meaningful work #1. They said that's the most important thing that I want in a job. It matters more to me than advancement, than what I'm getting paid, how secure my job is, and whether I have flexibility and the hours that I desire. Now, the question is, what changed between 1973 and 2000? Did anything change? And the answer is no. The list looks exactly the same in 2000 as it did in 1973, and it's looked exactly the same every single year the General Social Survey has been done. I think this says something really fundamental about human nature and human psychology, that we all want to do something meaningful that gives us a real sense of purpose. So that leads me to wonder, what can we do with this knowledge? Can we actually increase the motivation, the performance, the productivity, and the satisfaction of our workforces by trying to inject more meaning into work, by really enriching the jobs and the tasks people do to give them a sense of purpose? So I had these data handy when I was interviewing the call center reps in this orthopedic company. And I asked them these very simple questions. Why are you in this job? What are you hoping to get out of this work experience? I started, though, by asking their managers that question. And the managers unequivocally said they all came because they needed to basically support themselves and their families. And so they're here to try to maximize their income, and they really would like to have job security along with that. Lo and behold, I got very different answers when I asked the call center reps. First 11 people I interviewed, 10 of them told me the same thing. And I was really surprised by what that same thing was, which is they all said, I needed a job, yes, that's true. I definitely wanted to support my family. But I could have worked in a lot of different call centers. I chose an orthopedic call center because I'm passionate about healthcare, and I'm hoping to actually pursue a career in the healthcare space. And so I thought as long as I was answering phones and doing customer service kind of work, I could be in a domain where I could learn a little bit about healthcare. And maybe that would be sort of a launching pad for me to think about a career possibly as a medical technician, as a nurse, as a doctor. Maybe I could meet people who would serve as recommenders, who would help refer me to jobs that would be a better fit for my healthcare interests. None of the managers had any idea. They never sat down with the call center reps to actually figure out why are you here. And so they were really missing out on this information that could add a lot of meaning to work. In this case, the real sense of purpose in this call center job was to act, for the call center reps at least, was to experience their work as contributing to their development and their growth and their sense of mastery in healthcare. Once we had that information, we were able to make a lot of changes that actually increased the performance of the call center reps. One very simple opportunity was to say, look, we often provide learning and development opportunities just as free benefits. Well, instead, why don't we tie those to performance? And say if you can reduce your hold time, and you can reduce your number of missed calls, you can raise patient satisfaction, you can schedule people with the right doctors, then we're going to give you opportunities to do things like shadow a surgeon, like work the front desk where you have more patient contact, like have us actually support your education. In part because if we just pay you cash, you're going to end up paying bills with that. Whereas if we actually pay you in tuition reimbursement, that's going to give you the justification you need to actually pursue further education. So for me, this was a really powerful takeaway. It was very easy, I think, to assume that these people were only there for the money. But obviously, they were really there for the learning and growth and mastery opportunities that they thought the job was provided. I then went to another call center, looking for, again, this question of how can we make work more meaningful? This call center was at a large public university. I've been asked to keep it confidential, but I'll say for all of you here today, the mascot rhymes with the Mulverines. At this particular call center, these are the people who contact you. If you're an alumnus of this university, they try to ask you to donate your hard-earned money. And it's a miserable job by all accounts. The callers only have one task, which is soliciting alumni donations. There's no variety. They have very little autonomy. The call center is boiled really to a science. The fewest number of words that you need to say in a call to maximize the chance that some sucker, i.e. you, will actually give your hard-earned money to the university. So they don't actually get to have much freedom or flexibility around the script. Not only that, but they deal with a lot of really rude treatment from alumni who yell at them and berate them for interrupting their dinners. So when I entered the call center, annual turnover was over 400%. If you think about the practicality of that for a minute, imagine the entire staff that you work with quitting every 3 months and having to completely rehire, retrain, and remotivate employees several times a year. Not easy for them. So the contact to me basically said, look, we really want to improve things. We don't know if we can do anything about the turnover because the fundamental job is not that pleasant. But can you at least motivate the callers to work harder and raise more money while they're here? And I said yes, because one of I think the core elements of my training was first, do no harm. Kind of a little bit like you'd see in medicine. And in this case, things were so bad that I honestly believe they could not get worse. And so I knew no matter what I tried, I could not actually cause any kind of negative effect on the callers. So I entered the call center. And I wanted to just learn a little bit about what was driving the callers' effort, motivation, satisfaction, etc. I did some interviews, I did some surveys, but what really struck me was a sign that one of the callers had displayed on his wall. And I actually brought it here today because I found it so powerful. So I always wear dark suits after reading this, but in all seriousness, this for me was a really poignant statement. The caller is basically saying, look, I think that my work ought to be meaningful, but nobody cares about what I do. So one of the things that I ask the managers right after seeing this is, where does the money that the callers bring in actually go? They raise millions and millions of dollars a year for the university. Who benefits from it? And the manager said, we don't know. We're actually not allowed to give out that information. We're not sure how that would go over. I did a little bit of digging, and I found out that about 65% of all of all funds raised go to scholarships. So about 2/3 of every dollar actually helps underprivileged students attend that university. So I thought this is great information to share with the callers. So we have the managers come up in front of the callers. It's the beginning of the shift, and they're really excited to finally tell the callers, look, here's the meaning and purpose behind your work. Look at all these scholarship students who are being helped by the money that you raise. So they share some statistics, they tell a few stories, and my job is to basically track what happens to the caller's performance. So I measure how many calls they're making, how much time they're spending on the phone, and ultimately how much money they raise. Lo and behold, I look at the data, and many of the callers are pretty flat in their performance. So they're not making more calls, they're not spending more time on the phone, and they're definitely not raising more money. Some of the callers have actually declined. They're working less hard, and they're raising less money than before the managers actually delivered this message. Why? Why could this inspirational message from managers actually backfire? Well, after some follow-up research, what I found was that the callers didn't trust their managers. And they felt that the managers were basically trying to manipulate them into working harder without actually paying them more. And they thought, okay, gee, a great way to convince us that our work is incredibly important is to tell us about all the good that we're doing. But at the end of the day, this is still a miserable job. And we don't really trust the information the managers are sharing with us. So we're not going to respond in a positive way to that. So the managers were ready to give up. And I said, well, wait a minute, there's something we ought to think about here, which is we didn't really think carefully about who delivered this message. We're trying to inspire the callers. We're trying to show them how their work makes a difference. What if we actually outsource inspiration? They said, what do you mean? I said, well, think about who is the most credible source of this message. It's not your boss, right, talking about how these scholarship students will benefit from your work. It's the scholarship students themselves. So what if we brought in some scholarship students? Let's take a dozen of them. We'll have a panel. We'll have them all tell their stories, different walks of life, different majors, different career aspirations. And we'll try to really inspire the callers from the words of the end users, people who actually benefit from their efforts. The managers laugh at me. They then calculate the amount of time that we would require for this, and then show me the dollar cost of taking the callers off the phones in order to meet the scholarship students. They said, we can't do this, but we'll give you 5 minutes for one scholarship student. This is my turn to laugh, but I figured at minimum I could do a focus group and at least have the callers tell me, yeah, we liked meeting the scholarship student. Try to use that then as ammunition to convince the managers to give me more time. So I recruited a scholarship student. His name was Will. He's about 5'7". He was voted by his class as the guy most likely to become president. And he had a great story to tell. He said, look, I've always wanted to attend this university. I grew up out of state. My parents couldn't afford out-of-state tuition. We were all really bummed about this because Michigan is just in my blood. My brother was conceived after a Michigan football game, he said. And a lot of the callers had questions about that, which were not answered. But at the end of the day, he said, because of the work that you guys do, I was able to come to college here. And here's how it's really benefited me. Here's how much I appreciate the work that you all do. My hope was that all of a sudden feeling really appreciated by this scholarship student and feeling that their work made a difference in the lives of people like him would actually help to counter this feeling, right? You're being treated rudely by your alumni donors. You're being not necessarily treated that respectfully by your managers, but here's a group of end users who benefit from your work who actually values what you do and show you that your work makes a difference. So I look at the data, and there's a group of callers that got to meet Will and hear his story. And then there are several control groups who didn't and went about their work as usual. I was blown away when I looked at the results, and I'll just show you a little bit of the data here. Minutes on the phone. The average caller who met Will went from about 100 minutes on the phone per week to nearly 300. That's an increase of over 170% per caller. The control group actually doesn't change in a statistically significant manner. So something's happening here. When the callers meet the scholarship student, they're actually spending more time on the phone. The managers, of course, are suspicious. And they say, yeah, what they're doing is, when they talk to an interesting alumnus in France, they kind of extend the conversation and talk for like 90 minutes and, sort of rack up our phone bill. But they're not actually working more effectively. They're just, kind of drawing out the conversation. So I said, well, maybe one way to look at that is let's actually look at number of calls made, not just time spent on the phone. And that way we can see, are they spinning their wheels with the same alumni, or are they actually reaching more and more prospects? Look at calls per hour. The average caller goes from about 3 calls per hour to nearly 7 calls per hour after meeting that one scholarship student. The control group, again, doesn't change. So they are working harder. They're reaching more contacts. But the question is it actually producing any results? So I look at the revenue data, and I'm absolutely shocked, because the average caller has more than doubled in the amount of money raised per week after meeting that one scholarship student, whereas the control group showed no change whatsoever in the revenue that they brought in. Now, I thought this was a mistake. So one of the virtues of having really high turnover in your organization is that you have new subjects to experiment on every semester, right? So the good news is the callers all quit a month later, and I've got a whole new group of people to go through my intervention. So we tried again, and this time the results are even stronger. I'm going to show you the revenue results here, and just brace yourself, because this was hard for me to believe. Average caller starts out at $400 a week before meeting a scholarship student. After the fact, over $2,000 per week, and that lasts a full month. So you spend 5 minutes hearing from one scholarship student, and you show over 400% increases individual caller in your weekly money raised. 23 callers are in that blue line. They represent $38,000 extra per week for the organization. Not bad for a 5-minute intervention that costs $0, last time I checked. Now, that got me interested in a bunch of questions. One is, who is the best source of this kind of inspiring message? So one comparison that I conducted was with people like Will, very charismatic, very strong speakers, versus another scholarship student. I'll call her Emily today, because that's her name. Emily walked in. She was very shy, quiet, introverted freshman. And she came in. You could actually visibly see her shaking. And she said, "Hi, my name is Emily." And I literally couldn't hear her. And I'm standing there in the back, "Please speak up louder." And she finally says, "I got a scholarship that you guys really helped me get, and I wanted to thank you." And races out of there as fast as she could. I was really concerned that this was not going to work, because she didn't have the charisma of Will. But that was actually the strongest effect I've ever gotten. The callers worked harder and raised more money after hearing from Emily than they did from Will. Why? Well, it turns out that Will was so charismatic that he seemed a little bit slick and smooth. Whereas Emily, you knew she was genuine and authentic. She would not have been there in front of you unless this really mattered to her and she appreciated the work that you had done to support her scholarship. Moreover, she was so shy and nervous that you knew without that scholarship she was going nowhere in life. So I'm only half kidding, but at the end of the day, I thought that was a really interesting takeaway for us, and it got me thinking a lot about how could we apply this to other jobs. I think many of us work in jobs and manage people who work in jobs that really make a difference, but we don't actually get to see our end users. I'm going to give you a bunch of examples of this in a moment, but you can think of all kinds of products and services that people work on where they never meet their clients, they never meet their customers, they never meet the people who ultimately benefit down the value chain from the work that they do. And the question is there value of making that kind of connection? What I want to argue is yes, as long as it actually comes from the source. So I mentioned that the leaders didn't work. This was one controlled comparison I did. This is actually the Emily effect. So average caller in this particular version of the study goes from about $2,500 per week to nearly $10,000 per week. And if you get a leader to tell Emily's story instead of getting her to tell it, no benefit whatsoever. The leader group is no better off than the control. So what does this mean, I think, for the people that we manage and for our own work? A couple of things. The first thing is, let's go back to the radiologists. Remember I told you some of the radiologists improved in diagnostic accuracy in a 3-month period, a 46% jump. The reason they improved is because in the file, when they did their second diagnosis of the x-ray, was a photo of the patient whose x-ray it was. Just one photograph. They didn't get to hear from the patient. They didn't get to have any dialogue. They got no information. They literally just saw a picture. Putting the picture in the photo was enough to increase by 12% the length of the reports. It dramatically increased the amount of time they spent analyzing the report, and ultimately led them to actually discover many more problems in the x-ray. Just seeing that photo of the patient was enough to humanize the active work. It was enough to make them think, look, I'm not just evaluating this abstract x-ray. There is a living, breathing patient who's benefiting from what I do. Now, I might know that intellectually, right? I know that's why I do my job as a radiologist, but I don't feel it viscerally until I get to see that patient's face. There was another group of radiologists that went down in their performance. And that group actually just went through the reverse timing of the intervention. So the first time they saw the x-ray, it had the patient's photo in it. The second time, they got the same x-ray with no patient photo, and they did a lot worse. They didn't empathize. They didn't necessarily feel a strong level of concern for the patient, and as a result, they were less careful. So I think there are a lot of interesting examples of organizations, sometimes intentionally, sometimes accidentally, really trying to connect the dots between their employees and the end users who benefit from the work that they do. I'll throw out a couple of examples that I think are compelling, and I'd love to stimulate some discussion about what are some of the examples and applications that might make sense in your lives and your organizations. One of my favorite examples is the medical technology company Medtronic. Medtronic has always been a very mission-driven company. They see their work really in terms of restoring the health of patients who have been through some of the worst things you could possibly imagine. One of the ways that Medtronic really helps to connect employees to their impact on patients is they have an annual holiday party. They bring over 30,000 employees across the company together into a large room, and they invite 6 patients to tell their stories. And these patients have stories that are pretty remarkable. You could think, for example, about a patient who went through a terrible car accident and was paralyzed and was told that she would never walk again. She's wheeled up in a wheelchair on stage, and she says, I was told that I would never have the chance to walk again. And thanks to Medtronic's rehabilitation technology, here's what I can do. And she stands up out of her wheelchair, and everyone gasps. Then she proceeds to do cartwheels across the stage. And if you think about the power of that kind of experience, if you're a Medtronic engineer, technician, or even salesperson, to really see that the products you're designing and distributing could make that much of a difference in the lives of patients. Bill George, the former CEO, told me at one point that he believes every single Medtronic employee has a defining moment when they come face-to-face with a patient in that annual party, and they're able to really connect those people's lives to the broad, noble mission that Medtronic pursues. But you don't have to be a medical technology company that saves patients' lives to actually experience the power of this kind of connection. John Deere, I think, has a phenomenal practice in place. If you're a farmer and you buy a tractor, one of the things they invite you to do is to come to the John Deere factory to receive a gold key. And they make a little ceremony, they celebrate you, and they really see this as building a relationship with the farmer and giving you a chance to feel more tied to John Deere as a company. So it sounds like a marketing initiative, but it's more than marketing, because what they do is they ask you to sit up on your tractor, and they invite every single employee who worked on building and putting that tractor together to come and watch you start your tractor for the first time. And if you think of a typical farmer's reaction, that's a moment of real excitement when you just picked up your first tractor or a brand new tractor that's going to help you farm more effectively. You bring your family, and you really get to see, I think, a serious amount of joy that you've created for your customers. Facebook has been doing this as well, too. A couple years ago, the consumer marketing group said we'd like to really be able to promote some of the great things that Facebook is doing. And so we're going to start collecting stories from people whose lives have been changed by Facebook. We're going to collect, for example, stories of people who met their spouses on Facebook. We're going to find people who discovered their their biological parents when they were adopted because of the connections that Facebook was able to make. We're going to find people who are able to reconnect with their closest friends from growing up that they lost touch with. So they do all of this. They start to use it for a marketing initiative. And one of the managers said, wait a minute, what if we share this with our software developers? And what if we actually help the developers see that the software they're developing isn't just fun, but it could actually change people's lives? So they started inviting software developers to these events to hear some consumers who were really touched by Facebook talk about how meaningful it was in their lives. And they report a pretty significant spike in the average software developer's motivation and concern for developing user-friendly features, which I think is very consistent with what I found with these scholarship students in the fundraisers. I think that it's obviously most effective if you can bring the end user in directly to your organization. It's very difficult to substitute for that face-to-face contact, right? The one-on-one connection that you can make with a person who's sitting right in front of you. But some organizations are finding ways to substitute for that. Volvo has a great example of this. They have a Volvo Save My Life Club, where if you feel or you're told by a police officer or an EMT that a Volvo car has really made a difference in your life during an accident, you're asked to join this club. And in the club, you actually write a story and you deliver an audio recorded message that talks about what Volvo has meant in your life. And that's available on the Volvo website for engineers and other Volvo employees to really be reminded again that what they do every day has an impact on drivers and passengers. And again, they might know it abstractly, but it's very different to see it from a particular customer. At Wells Fargo, there's a great example of a senior manager who said, look, one of the things we really want to do is we want to motivate our bankers to really think about selling a product that could change people's lives, that could help them get out of debt, or that could help them afford a home. And this particular manager created what he called wow videos, which were stories of people who had used this product before, talking about how it enabled them to do things like get out of debt and buy their first house, which they thought they'd never be able to afford. He shows these to bankers, and he would actually see some of his bankers who he perceived as very cold, calculative, analytical, logical people almost break down into tears because they never really thought about how much of an impact their work could have on these kinds of people on a daily basis. And it got them a lot more excited about the product. So I think there are a couple implications more broadly if you think about this kind of practice. One is to really think carefully about who your end users are. I think a lot of us assume that we know who our clients are, we know who our customers are. But this isn't always the case. Take, for example, a company that sells baby food. As of the late 1980s, it was a little bit difficult to inspire employees at that particular company because babies can't very well talk and express easily how much they love that food. Well, there's a group in Florida that discovered that lots and lots of elderly people were buying baby food because it was much gentler on their teeth. And this is a really novel message to bring into your employees that not only are you helping to promote the nutrition of babies, you're also able to make a much easier daily eating experience for elderly people who have lost their teeth or are suffering from dentures. And I thought that was a really interesting example of saying, look, you might know who your dominant customer is. You might be familiar with sort of your common clients. But are there some really original or novel sources of these messages who could come in and tell their stories? I think, though, obviously, these stories are only compelling if they are new, if it expresses something about the impact of your work, the importance of your product, the meaning of your service that you hadn't seen before. And then, of course, I think it's important to be able then to figure out how would we actually deliver these messages on a regular basis so that employees can actually attach their daily work to the ultimate purpose and meaning and impact of what they're doing on their end users. I think there's a lot more that one could say about this. For those of you who are interested in reading further, as Sean mentioned, Dan Pink's book, Drive, if you haven't read it, does a wonderful job looking at motives for purpose and meaning, as well as autonomy and mastery and how those drive motivation at work. I think Switch and Influence are two wonderful takes as well on really creative ways to motivate employees. But I think if I were to leave you with one message today, it would be to say, look, most of us want to do meaningful work. We want to do work that makes a lasting difference in the lives of other people, that makes us feel appreciated, valued, and even remembered. But many of our jobs are not set up to make that connection between us and the people who benefit most. And so if you can establish that connection for you or for your employees, I think there are tremendous motivational gains to be realized. Thank you all very much.